I'm Bill with TANDEMKROSS, making good guns great. Our line of Victory flat-face competition-ready triggers have been popular with shooters of all stripes, and a big part of that is their adjustable pre- and post-travel that allows you to fine-tune the feel of your trigger to get exactly the shooting experience you want. But you might be wondering, what exactly are pre- and post-travel, and how should I adjust them? Well, let me show you. We'll start with post-travel. Post-travel is how far the trigger can move once it passes the point where the hammer drops. Every TANDEMKROSS Victory trigger, no matter what firearm it's for, comes with a post-travel adjustment screw and a small Allen wrench to adjust it with. The screw goes in the lower tip of the pulling surface, and you can use the Allen wrench to turn this screw and change how much length is sticking out the back of the trigger. The more screw there is sticking out, the sooner the trigger bumps against the frame and the less post-travel there'll be. If you have too much sticking out though, the trigger won't pull far enough to actually drop the hammer. Competition shooters generally prefer as little post-travel as possible, but some people prefer the feel of more post-travel. Let me show you how I quickly and easily adjust the trigger so that there's very little post-travel.
To do this, you will need any tools required to separate the upper and the lower. That could mean Allen wrenches, screwdrivers, or nothing, depending on the model of firearm. You'll also need an empty magazine. To start, make sure your firearm is clear and safe, and then follow your manufacturer's instructions to separate the upper from the lower. Then insert the empty magazine. Make sure your safety is on, and start turning the post-travel adjustment screw clockwise. You'll want to screw it in so far that it can't possibly fire. Then make sure your safety is on fire, and while pulling the trigger, start unscrewing the post-travel screw. Eventually, you will unscrew it far enough that the trigger will be able to pull back enough to drop the hammer. I usually unscrew it just a tiny bit more because if it's right on the edge, it doesn't always work consistently. Test it a few times to make sure it's consistent. And then you're done.
Now, let's talk about pre-travel. Pre-travel is the opposite of post-travel. It's how far the trigger can move before the hammer drops. Not every TANDEMKROSS Victory trigger has an adjustable pre-travel screw. For some of the firearms we support, it just wasn't possible to add due to their design. Instead, we designed those triggers to have very little pre-travel from the start. Competition shooters tend to favor very little pre-travel so that the trigger can be pulled as quickly and easily as possible with as little movement as necessary overall. But some shooters prefer more pre-travel for safety reasons, since having very little pre-travel may make it easier to accidentally pull the trigger when you don't want to. Let me show you how I quickly and easily adjust the trigger so that there's very little pre-travel.
To adjust the pre-travel on triggers with a pre-travel screw, you're going to need all the same tools you needed for post-travel. And the process begins very similarly. Make sure your firearm is clear, remove the upper from the lower, and insert an empty magazine. Then set your safety on fire and drop the hammer. You will find your pre-travel screw at the top of the trigger pointing up. Start turning it clockwise. You'll want to screw it so far in that if you cock the hammer back, you can't drop it by pulling the trigger. Then, start screwing it back out and listen very carefully. Eventually, you will hear a little click and you may see the trigger bar move slightly. The hammer will now be able to drop. Like with the PostTravel screw, I usually back it out just a tiny bit more, just so that it works consistently. But test it a few times, and if it works, then you're done.
A quick word about the Victory trigger for the Browning Buckmark. It doesn't have an adjustable PreTravel screw, but its PreTravel is adjustable to a certain extent. The Buckmark is kind of a quirky gun, and over the years that it's been in production, the tolerances on its parts and frame have varied wildly, and its design has changed a little bit. As a result, the Victory trigger may work just fine on some Buckmark models, but fit inconsistently or not work at all on other models. And the most common issue with our trigger is it not having enough PreTravel out of the box, so that the hammer doesn't drop and reset correctly. The fix for this is to file a little bit off the top of this shelf part of the trigger. In this case, you can only adjust it so that there's more PreTravel, and you can't go back and fix it if you file too much. So if you choose to or need to use this method to get the trigger where you want it, be sure to go slowly and carefully and only file off a little bit at a time. A few more things to consider when you're making these adjustments. These small screws are very sensitive. Little changes can make a big difference, including changes in the environment. If you adjust your pre and post travel in a cool environment and then go shoot in a hot environment, the screws can expand. And if you've taken all of your pre and post travel out, just a little expansion can make your gun suddenly stop shooting, which is why I always recommend you keep a little bit of travel in on both sides. The other thing to consider is Loctite. Most people will recommend that you Loctite your screws so that they don't walk out after a day at the range. And I agree that Loctiting is a good idea, but for these screws, it might not be the best idea. Loctite requires two things to harden: pressure and the absence of air, which is why it works so well for most screws. You put a little dab of Loctite on, you screw the screw in all the way, and you let it sit overnight. The pressure and lack of air between the threads cures the Loctite and traps the screw right where you want it. You can't really put Loctite on after the fact though. It doesn't work like glue on the outside of the trigger because it won't harden when it's in contact with air. So for screws that take a lot of fiddling around to get them right where you want them, or screws that you might be adjusting frequently, Loctite may not be the best option. So one solution that many competitive shooters use instead is a little bit of clear nail polish. You can apply the nail polish over the ends of the screw after you've gotten them where you want them, and it can be easily removed with a little acetone if you want to adjust it again. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions or suggestions about this video, be sure to let me know in the comments, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, and the little bell icon next to the subscribe button so that you get notifications whenever we upload new content. You can also find us elsewhere on the internet like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, you can find all of these Victory triggers plus many more products for many other firearms at www.tandemkross.com. And keep an eye on our site and our social media because we'll be releasing a new trigger pretty soon. Until then, see ya.